Everybody, Joanna here. I'm part of the team at Gateway Buda. I serve with the kids and also the food pantry. If you are new to Gateway, I just wanted to welcome you. Bienvenidos a Gateway. We are an authentic, loving community where you can come as you are. We have communities all over the place to connect you with. If you're here in Buda, South Austin, Central Austin, North Austin, Dripping Springs, Pflugerville, anywhere. So come as you are. We love to connect you guys.
And if you're new to Gateway, we would love to hear from you. The easiest way to connect with us is to go online to gatewaychurch.com and click on the button that says Get Connected. Then let us know where you're watching from, and if you're in Austin or the surrounding areas, we'll send you a copy of Not Like Me, a book written by one of our pastors about loving and serving others in our divided world.
Hey guys, Jesse here, the Gateway Buda campus pastor. I'm so glad to be here with you guys. We're at the point of the service. We're gonna receive our offering. And like we always say here at Gateway, if this is your first time checking us out, please let this service be our gift to you. But for those of us that call Gateway our home, or maybe for you, you've been tuning in for a little while and you're wanting Gateway to be your home, this is our opportunity to give back because all that God has done through us in our communities and all around the world. And you can give by going to gatewaychurch.com/givehelp or click on the link Give Help. When you click on that, it's going to bring up a drop-down box of the campuses. Make sure you choose Buda campus. Just kidding, not kidding. No, really, choose the campus that you attend or your home campus. Guys, your generosity has made such a difference in our communities. Just one of the ways is through our food bank. We've served nearly 1,000 families across all of our campuses, over 1,200 people alone right here at the Buda campus. So thank you for your generosity. It has made us such a huge difference. And for those of you that have been giving, you're going to get an update with all of the different ways that your generosity has impacted our community and the world. And guys, as always, Gateway, we love you, and we're looking forward to gathering with you soon.
Next week, we're going to hear from Aman Quadri, who I have known for years, as he shares his story about how he was a Muslim boy who grew up to be a Christian traveling the world with the medical community. You won't want to miss it, so invite your friends, invite your family, and tune in with us next week online. But this week, we're going to hear from J. Werner Wallace, author of Cold Case Christianity, as he's interviewed by Jesse. Let's check it out together.
Hey, what's up, Gateway? This is Jesse, the campus pastor for Buda. So glad you're tuning in with us this morning. We have the opportunity to interview J. Werner Wallace, who wrote the book, Cold Case Christianity. And the conversation today is about investigating the claims of Christianity. And so whether you've been following Jesus for many years, or maybe for you still haven't come to closure fully on who Jesus says that he is, or the claims that he made, either way, the conversation is for all of us. And so I want to welcome J. Werner Wallace joining us from Zoom. Hey, Jim, how are you?
Doing good. Yeah, I'm actually pretty far away from you guys. I'm between Los Angeles and San Diego, so I'm just glad to be able to hop on with you guys. This is awesome.
Yeah. So glad to have you with us. I read your book over the weekend, Cold Case Christianity, and I got to say it was fascinating. As someone who also came to faith at the age of 35, also a skeptic, I just thought that the book was thoughtful and very intentional. And I want to say that God has gifted you uniquely, not only as a homicide detective and a cold case investigator, and how you've brought so much closure to families who've gone through a lot of pain and suffering through not knowing how their families or loved ones died. But also, you're bringing closure to people who are investigating the gospel and challenging them to really investigate these claims before coming to closure too soon. And so I want to say the work that you're doing is so important, so necessary, and it's such a blessing to us and the church. And so thank you for that. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to dive in. So would you pray with me? So God, I just thank you for the work that Jim is doing. God, thank you for his heart. to really help people understand the claims, God. We know that it's not enough just to blindly believe, that we should investigate these claims that you say are true, God. And so for anyone that's watching, and for any of us where there's any stumbling block, maybe a barrier in the way right now, I just ask that that would be removed and we would really have open hearts, open minds, open ears to what's being shared today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So Jim, let's dive in. As someone who came to faith at the age of 35, also a skeptic, how did you approach investigating the claims of Christianity?
Well, look, I was not raised in the church, as you said. I didn't have any friends who were Christians. In Los Angeles County, it's pretty easy to grow up in a niche of the county where you might not know anybody who goes to church. And I didn't know that anybody growing up. And the only people I knew who were Christians early, before I became a Christian, I was already working as a detective, and I will tell you that most of the people that I took to jail would tell me that they were Christians. So I knew that group. I also knew some detectives who would say they were Christians, but they'd been raised in the church. They didn't use their detective thinking to become Christians. They just happened to be Christians in the church growing up. And I'm not even sure that these detectives knew they could think their way into the system. But it turns out that I used the skill set I had working cases. Like a lot of the things I do in a cold case are similar. Cold cases are just unsolved murders because murder is the only crime that there is no statute of limitations. I can go back and look at those years later. A robbery will eventually close. Murders do not. So I took that skill set that I had evaluating eyewitnesses. Typically, I get reports. They're sitting back here on my shelves back here. They're in big, thick notebooks, and I have to read through those supplemental reports to figure out what happened 35 years ago. I treated the Gospels like supplemental reports, and I said, could I use the same approach to determine what happened that long ago? And this really is not that big of a difference. You might think, well, 35 years versus 2,000. Look, once your witnesses are not available to you, it could be 70 years, 700 years. It doesn't really matter. Your witnesses are no longer available to you. So that's the approach I took to examine the Gospels.
Wow, it's fascinating. I read your book, Cold Case Christianity, over the weekend, like I'd said. And what I want to say is that you talked right early on in the book about having presuppositions and how they can affect our worldview. Can you speak just a little bit about that?
Look, if we're asking a question, is Christianity true? If you're going to start off with the conclusion it's not, okay, well, then you're not going to get very far because you've already decided. You're not open to this situation. You've already decided. This happens lots of times in criminal cases where you walk into a crime scene and because you've done 1,000 of these, right? You've done so many of these, got a dead body and who does she know? If it's a woman on the ground, you're looking for her boyfriend, you're looking for her husband. That is, most of the time, probably somebody she knows is involved as the killer. But if I start off assuming it's somebody she knows, I have to leave that kind of hold it open-handedly, right? I cannot make a decision that blocks out every other possibility. Here's what happens when you do that. You'll start to see the evidence in the crime scene through your presupposition. And something that you might be able to attribute to a boyfriend or a husband, you will attribute to that boyfriend or husband, even though they may not even exist. You just thought, well, it's probably going to be a boyfriend or a husband. And I have been on a couple of these cases where I have assumed something up front. So I always say, look, whatever your investigation is, don't assume you know who the suspect is or what's true or false until you start digging through the evidence. Let the evidence tell you what's true or false. Don't be a know-it-all, is what I typically say. And because I have false started. I can remember one case famously that I misstarted. And afterwards, I had no credibility with my team. It was the first homicide I ever worked. And sure enough, I bit quickly on what I thought would be the killer. And it wasn't him. It was somebody else who lived with him. And so I made the mistake. Don't be a know-it-all. At least be fair about your presuppositions. And for us, honestly, most of the time is that I presume up front that nothing supernatural could ever happen. Jesus could be a teacher. I'm good with that. But don't tell me Jesus walked on water because I already assume up front that nothing miraculous like that ever happens. So therefore, I'm going to reject out of hand because I'm holding a presuppositional bias against anything that's outside of an explanation using just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Well, folks, there's lots of stuff that's outside of space, time, physics, space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. I'll give you an example of that. Big Bang cosmology demonstrates that the universe came into existence from nothing. This is what the science demonstrates. This is called the standard cosmological model. That means whatever started all space, time, and matter must be outside of space, time, or matter. You cannot create yourself. Well, that means you've already embraced something outside of space, time, and matter. Why would you hold a presuppositional bias against things that are outside of space, time, and matter if you begin by accepting such a thing? So just hold on to your biases and be fair.
Something that really stuck out to me, you talk about the difference between what's possible and what's reasonable. I wish I had really known about that as raising kids. Now I'm going to use it on my kids because it's a fascinating principle, very simple, but it makes all the difference. Can you explain just a little bit about the difference between what's possible and what's reasonable?
Well, a lot of times we resist a claim because we have a standard of proof that we think I have to have every question answered and I have to get beyond all possible doubt before I can decide something is true. Well, we ask that question in jurors when we evaluate them for criminal trials. Are you the kind of person who has to have every question answered? Are you the kind of person who can't have a possible doubt? And if they say, well, yeah, I'm really a stickler that way, well, then you're excused because we cannot put you on a panel. That standard of proof beyond a possible doubt is not the legal standard for the most heinous crimes in America. That standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a lower standard. I have had cases, they're called no body missings, where you have a woman who was killed by her husband and he got rid of her body and buried it someplace, and you don't even have a body. And you don't know if she's just missing or if she's actually dead. And so I can't answer questions for the jury. I had one case, for example, where I couldn't tell you, how did he kill her? Don't know. What room was she in? I don't know. What did he do with her body? I don't know. Where is she today? I don't know. How did he move her body without being detected? I don't know. How did he move her car? I don't know. I could not answer what you might think are the most important questions you could possibly ask. But that wasn't my burden. I could demonstrate that he did it without knowing for sure how he did it. And that's a much lower standard. I get reasonable doubt. Now, if you're looking at Christianity for the first time, or you've been looking at it for years, at least be fair. There is no worldview you can hold, from atheism to Buddhism to Hinduism to Baha'i, whatever it is. There is no worldview you can hold in which you can say truthfully that you have every question answered. As an atheist, I held a worldview for 35 years in which I could not really tell you with certainty how the universe came into existence, why it appears to be fine-tuned, how life emerged in the universe from non-life, why it appears to be designed, biology, but in fact we would say it's not as an atheist, why we have minds in addition to brains, and why we have free agency, our minds can think freely, why there's an objective moral standard, why there's even a standard of righteousness that we refer to when we say something is objectively evil. Look, I didn't have answers for any of those questions, but I was willing to hold on to my atheism. So it turns out that you are already holding a worldview for which you cannot answer every possible question. Don't let that stop you from considering Christianity.
Yeah, for those tuning in, just to maybe help you understand what's possible versus what's reasonable. It's possible I could grow a mohawk. It's not reasonable.
Judges actually tell juries not to get hung up on possible, they'll say in California, or imaginary doubts. Those are things you say, well, what if? And you imagine something. Like, what if she wasn't killed by her husband, but a burglar happened to break into the house? Well, do you have any evidence of burglaries in that neighborhood at that time? Is there any forced entry in the house? No. Is there anything missing from the house from a burglary? No. Okay, then you're just what-ifing. That's not based on evidence. That's based on your what-ifing. And we don't allow you to what-if in jury deliberation. So you have to have some grounding, some basis in evidence for it to be a reasonable doubt.
Yeah. Yeah, can you walk us through, how do you determine between what's possible versus what's reasonable? What process do you follow to show that evidence?
Well, we don't do this. Sometimes people will say, is it a percentage? Like, no, if I'm at 85%, is that enough for me to see? No, it's not a percentage. How would you ever calculate that percentage? We tell jurors to use their common sense, number one. That's a jury instruction. And we tell jurors that they are not to consider imaginary claims. Look, you're going to have 6 weeks with these defense team and the prosecution team, and they're going to present all kinds of evidence. Your conclusions must be drawn from evidence presented. And most of the time, we'll say things like, yeah, but, what if? Or you'll try to imagine. If you find yourself imagining, you're in the realm of possible doubt and not in reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubts are always grounded. So here's what I would say. You got your doubts, write them on the wall. Now, once you've written them all down, ask yourself, is this doubt caused? So for example, I've heard people say, hey, you know what? There's no way that those gospels could be written that early. Now, I make a case in that book for manuscript case based on manuscript evidence for why I believe the gospels are written early. Now, if you say, well, no, they must have been written late, 2nd, 3rd century. Well, then write down what is the evidence upon which you're basing that doubt. Now, it turns out, as I talk to skeptics about this, most skeptics would say, well, it's got to be after 70 AD because there are accurate predictions in the Gospels in which Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. That didn't happen until 70 AD. So therefore, the Gospel author must have written this post 70 AD because I have a bias that tells me that I don't believe in predictions. I don't believe in prophecy. Now, I can show you 10 pieces of manuscript evidence that demonstrate it's early. But what's keeping you out is you have a bias against the possibility. It's not like your bias is not like your doubts are based on manuscript evidence that demonstrates it's a late gospel. There is no manuscript evidence to demonstrate the gospels are late. Instead, you have an imaginary doubt that you are based on your bias when all of the manuscript evidence says it's earlier. I think that's the difference between possible and reasonable doubt.
Yeah, it's good. You talk about abductive reasoning in your book. How do you lay that out?
And I'm gonna share a screen here so you can see it. So let me open that up. Now I'll tell you that we use abductive reasoning at every death scene because not every death scene is a murder scene. Sometimes people die for other reasons other than being killed. So I'm just going to start this with you real quick, and then I'll share the screen with you. All right, so I want you to imagine you're going along with me, and you're going to be at a crime scene with me in which you are going to be examining a dead body. Okay. Now, don't worry. This dead body is just my son. So here he is. Now, how do we know if this guy was killed? Well, there's 4 ways to die. We're going to base this death, and we're going to figure it out based on the evidence that's in the room. So we're going to have to first look at the evidence that's in the room and ask the question, do we have a good reason to believe this is something other than a natural death? Well, I'll give you an example. We're going to take 2 lists that begin with an E. One's a list of evidence, and one's a list of explanations. Now, the evidence we have in the room so far is we just have a dead guy laying face down. That's it. How do we explain dead guys laying face down? Well, they could die naturally. They could have died by accident. They could have died by some form of suicide, or they could have been killed by somebody. These are the 4 ways that people die. We're going to use abductive reasoning. We're going to compare evidence to explanations. That's what abductive reasoning is. Now, so far, all 4 of these are in play because he might have had a heart attack, he would look like that. If he accidentally took too many pills, he would look like that. If he intentionally took too many pills, he would look like that. If I poisoned him with too many pills, he would look like that. So right now, we really can't cross out anything here. But as we add details, so for example, if there was a pool of blood center torso, well, now we can go back and we can eliminate certain things because we have more evidence. And now it's no longer reason. Is it possible that it's a natural death? Yeah, but where are you going to bleed out center torso naturally? Okay, I would say anything is possible, but it's not reasonable, and that's why I cross it out. But everything else is still in play until I roll him over and say, now, what if he had a knife in his bag? Okay, well, this would change things. And now I can say, well, accidental is probably not as reasonable. But if he can reach that knife with his hands, he could have still stabbed. Okay, maybe not, but I'd still in play, suicide and homicide. Let's change it. What if he's got multiple stab wounds in his upper back? Well, now that changes things. Do you see what we're doing? We're simply adding to our evidence list, and then we are crossing out what is no longer reasonable. And this approach, no longer reasonable, is called abductive reasoning, comparing evidence. Now, we do the same thing with the gospel, with the resurrection account. This is how I approach the resurrection. If you're telling me that you believe that the resurrection is true, well, I need to know, what is your evidence for that? Now, granted, the evidence is going to come out of the claims of history. There are lots of claims related to the resurrection that history seems to affirm. At least the minimal claims would be that, hey, Jesus lived. If you think Jesus didn't live, some people think that Jesus is a created mythology. I am more than happy to I've looked at that deeply. That's even Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, would say that those folks who think that Jesus never lived are out of their minds. And Bart's probably one of the more articulate skeptics of Christianity. So I would say that he lived, that he was executed on a cross, that afterwards the tomb was empty, that he died on that cross and was buried, but the tomb is empty later. I mean, if the tomb, look, if you want to end this thing in the first century, just get the body of Jesus and drag it around town. It's game over. No one ever did that. So it is pretty clear that if that was possible, they would have done it, but they weren't able to do it. Also, you get the witnesses to recant. That's the second way. Now, interestingly, the witnesses never recanted, but that's very minimal evidence. All that could be true, Jesse, and it could still be a lie, Christianity. There could be an empty tomb, but it's still a lie. Somebody stole the body. There could be people who say it's true, but it's still a lie because they're lying or they're hallucinating. In other words, I have to list all the ways to explain the very minimal evidence that's in the room. And I did that as an atheist. As an atheist, I listed 7 ways to explain the minimal data that I was willing to accept as an atheist about Jesus. And I simply went through each one to see if that explanation actually works. And it turns out that none of them work. Now you get to the Christian explanation, I still resisted it, but it does work best if I am willing to surrender my bias against the supernatural.
What about for skeptics that say, well, maybe Jesus didn't die? Right. Maybe that they were wrong. You know, it seems like an easy thing to spot, Jim, that someone that's dead, but being a homicide and cold case detective, could you walk us through that even? Like, what is that?
I'm with you. I think this is something that you could make this case that he's not dead. Because look, if he's not dead, it's not a resurrection. It's just a resuscitation. He could be badly beaten. He could be unconscious on the, according to Scripture, he was executed with 2 other criminals, thieves, on the cross next to him. And when they came to collect the bodies, those 2 thieves were not yet dead. They broke their legs to make sure they were dead. Now, why didn't they break Jesus' legs? According to Scripture, they didn't. Now, I want you to think about that. That means that, okay, you came by later and you executed 3 guys, and 2 of them aren't dead. Why would you think the 3rd one is dead? You could actually make a case that Jesus never died from the pages of Scripture, okay? But there's an interesting piece of hidden science. It's in the Gospel of John, in which John says they didn't break Jesus' legs, but they stabbed him with a spear. And from his side came a separation of blood and water. And I tell you, that was interesting to me. Here's why. I wanted to know, I know why water would separate from blood in a dead person whose heart has already stopped beating. I already know, I've seen it. So I know what that looks like. But how would John know? In other words, this is pretty advanced stuff. This is called pleural effusion. And you can get either pericardial effusion, is after your heart stops, you get a water sac, it kind of grows around your heart, but it's very small compared to the other kind of effusion, which is pleural effusion. If you're in the right position and your heart stops beating, your lungs will collect water. Now, if I stab your chest cavity, you'll see water separate out. Now, the question is, would John as a fisherman have known that? I don't think he does know that. I'll tell you why. If you read the church fathers who read about that passage, I don't care if it's Tertullian, Origen, whoever you read, in the first 5 centuries, no one thinks John's telling the truth about that. Everyone says, all the church fathers say, it couldn't have been water. Why would there be water coming out? It must just be he's alluding to something else. He is using a metaphor. He is an allegory. It's some kind. He's trying to make an allegory, a metaphor for the Holy Spirit, maybe, or for the water baptism. It cannot be water, because why would water come out of his chest? Well, we know now from the science that that's what happens under pleural effusion. But that means your heart has to already stop beating in order to get that kind of collection of water. Now that means he's already dead, based on a piece of hidden science in the Gospel of John. Also, let's be honest. Most of us who are watching or listening to this right now don't handle a lot of dead bodies. Some of us do. Some of us are first responders, or we work in mortuary homes, or we work in hospitals, and we've handled dead people. If you have, you already know that dead people do not look like unconscious actors in performances, okay? I can tell a dead person from across the room. They behave differently. They look different. Now, just because you and I in the 21st century are not familiar with death, this does not mean people in the first century weren't familiar with it. As a matter of fact, you had to give birth in your own family with midwives. You had to be there for all of that. You had to figure out how to do that. You had to figure out how to take care of dead bodies, because there was no coroner, there was no funeral home to call and collect the body. The people who would be most familiar with death are not people in the 21st century, they're people in the first century. And there are 3 things, it's called the mortis triad, that occur when you die. We see it in homicide investigations all the time. The first one is you start to lose your temperature. rigor mortis. You start to cool down because your hot blood is not coursing through your veins. So if you touch dead people, they feel colder than living people because they're no longer. But the second mortis, the mortis triad, is rigor mortis. You start to get stiff. So if you're in a cross position and then I take you down from that cross position, it's not like your arms are going to flop down to your sides. They're going to slowly descend to your sides because rigor mortis is setting in. And third is probably the one that people don't even think about, but I think it's the most telling, and that's called livor mortis. And what that is a discoloration of your skin based on the fact that once your heart stops pushing your blood, gravity starts to draw it. So if you die on your back and I get there and roll you over, your back's going to be discolored. It's going to be purple and red and bruised looking because all the blood is settled. If you die in an upright position on a cross, your feet will swell and they will discolor. And all of these things would have been available to people in the first century who understood these obvious signs of death, even though you and I might be learning them right now for the very first time. So is it possible that he didn't die? I always say, if you ask me if something's possible, I will always say yes. It's possible you're not even listening to this right now. You're still in bed dreaming it, okay? There are people who think, philosophers, who think the entire universe we're living in today is a computer simulation. That is possible. But is it reasonable? I don't think it's reasonable that he didn't die on the cross, and that's why I had to jettison it as an explanation.
You know, what about people that say, well, they lied about the resurrection, that this is a big conspiracy? I think even before coming to faith, that's something that I would even say as an argument against Christianity. What would you say to that? Yeah,
okay, I want to show you what's required for conspiracy. I know a lot of people love conspiracy theories. We just do. We love them in books. We love them in theater. We love them in movies. And right now, we are in the midst of how many conspiracy theories related to COVID-19, related to whatever's going on, are people buying into right now? I mean, we love conspiracy theories. But here's the problem with conspiracy theories, and I'll just show it to you. And it's that conspiracies require 5 things. Now, I'm going to share a screen with you again, so be patient with me as I hop over here to do that. And these 5 things would have to be present in order for any conspiracy to be successful. I just don't think they're successful. This is one of them. Now, do I think that there are successful conspiracies? Of course I do. But if you think you know of a successful conspiracy, Jesse, it's not successful. Okay? But to be successful means you never found out. Successful conspiracies require these 5 things. Number 1, a small number of co-conspirators. You want the smallest possible number of co-conspirators. 2 people can tell a lie and get away with it better than 22. Also, you want to hold it for the shortest period of time. So it's harder to hold a lie and keep a lie for a year than it is for a day. The best conspiracy is 2 people go off and do something they shouldn't do. They lie about it, and the next day one kills the other. Okay, now we're down to 1, and it's a short conspiracy. Third thing, you need excellent communication between co-conspirators, because if someone jams up one of you and says, hey, what was happening? Your story better match the other one. That's why the first thing we do as detectives is we separate suspects to see if their stories match. If they can't communicate with each other, it's harder. Also, it's easier to lie for your brother if you're in a conspiracy with your brother than somebody who's not in a relationship to you. And finally, if there's no pressure and no one's asking you, well, then you're going to be okay. Now, look, if you're telling me that the Christian story is a conspiracy, it would have to have all 5 of these things to be reasonable. Now, I think already the problem is there's too many people involved. It's not just James and John and Peter, the 3, and it's not just the 12. You remember in the upper room there were 120. Remember there were 500 who saw the Christ on the same day, according to Paul, when he talks to the Corinthians. Let's play like a game of Clue. You remember the old school Clue? This is the old school Clue board. I'm going to change the board just slightly. Here's the board with the area around where Jesus and his disciples did their ministry, and the game pieces will be the disciples. This game of Clue, the first question is, well, first of all, there's way too many. If you ask me, there's way too many. That's not reasonable. But how long do they have to hold it? Shorter is better. They have to hold it for 6 decades. You're telling me that 500 plus who saw the risen Christ held on to this and nobody recanted for 60 years? Well, maybe they had great communication between each other. They could keep their story the same. No, they're not in that holy huddle. They're all over the game board. So the question becomes, how do I know, Thomas in India, what Matthew in North Africa is saying? How does Matthew know what Paul is saying? There's no way to communicate in this time to know that the stories and by the way, regardless of region, their stories all match. even though they're separated by thousands of miles. And were they pressured? Well, you know this game of Clue, right? Clue is one of those games that has these little weapons in it. But trust me, these guys were pressured, seriously pressured. You remember Jack Bauer in 24, that old series? Jack would do whatever's necessary to get the confession. And that's exactly what they were trying to do with these guys. And no one ever changed their story, even though there were some others, James and John and Peter and Andrew. Matthew at the bottom of the board there, who's in North Africa, he was not related to any of these guys. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even admired by any of these guys. He was the tax collector called Levi. Yet he writes one of the earliest Gospels and never changes his story. There's the problem as I see it. And I'll stop sharing at this point right now. That's the problem as I see it, is that there's no, is it possible this is a conspiracy? Sure. But you really, if you have not, is it possible that it's a conspiracy? Yes. But honestly, if you have not investigated conspiracies, that's why it seems so reasonable to you. That's why it seems like beyond possible, it seems reasonable. Once you've worked conspiracies, and I've done a bunch of these, that doesn't give me any pause at all. I know it can't be a conspiracy. There's too many people. All those conditions aren't being met. It's not reasonable.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I love it. You even mentioned this, that maybe the followers of Jesus were hallucinating. Maybe they thought South Jerusalem was like South Austin. What would you say to that?
Well, okay, look, hallucinations are interesting. I can have, for example, a vision, but if you told me details of my vision, that would freak me out. So if I said, hey, I had a dream last night that I was driving down Mulholland and I was in a red Tesla, and you said, oh yeah, it was a ragtop, beige ragtop, you had the top down. How would you know that? And you were listening to music. You had Ed Sheeran on the radio. How would you know that? I mean, this is like weird, right? We don't have group dreams. We have singular dreams. And when we have group things like this, they're called memories, okay? And the problem I have with any kind of hallucination is that there's too many group settings by too many different authors in too many different settings. Look, I can understand why you might say, well, Mary sees Jesus in the garden and she wants him to be alive so desperately. That's why she imagines this. Okay. That's reasonable, I think. Peter, there's at least one single sighting of Peter in Scripture. James, a single sight. But then you get to someone like Paul who sees Jesus on the Damascus Road. Wait a minute, hold on. Paul does not want Jesus to be alive, so he's imagining this. Then you get multiples, like the road to Emmaus, the Marys at the tomb, the 7 disciples at the sea, the 11, or 10 rather, because you have no Thomas originally and no Judas originally, 10 who see him. You have the upper room with Thomas. Now you have 11. You have the Emmaus disciples who see him at the ascension. Look, there's too many people. And by the way, there's a way to falsify that. If you thought, you know what, you guys are imagining this, run back to the tomb. There should be a body in the tomb if you're just imagining the resurrection appearances. So there's a way to kind of falsify these kinds of claims. And so if you're saying, well, no, the body's been taken out of the tomb. Well, now I'm back into some form of conspiracy theory. And we've already talked about why I don't embrace that. So is it possible they hallucinated it? Sure, anything's possible, but it's not a reasonable inference. And by the way, when you see that skeptics like myself have a palette of 6 possible ways to explain the resurrection, do you know why there's 6 variations? Because they know that none of these work. So if you're holding to the resurrection as a hallucination, it's because you don't think that it's a lie and you don't think other explanations work. If you're holding to it's a lie, it's because you don't think the hallucination. They already know. I already knew. Those things don't really work. That's why there are so many variants of those explanations, because none of them really work.
Yeah, I know for me, even before coming to faith, when someone would even mention the word miracles or, everything that would happen in your life, oh, that's a miracle. That became a barrier to me, even being remotely interested in faith. I always believed that things were almost random, that there were occurrences or coincidences, but not miracles.
No, I'm exactly the same way you are. Even today, I don't know if you struggle. I struggle with this today. Do you struggle with it today? I feel like if somebody was to come to me and say, God did this, or God said this, or God, I am always skeptical. And for me, it's just the shadow that lingers from my so many years, 35 years as an atheist, that I am more inclined to think, I think that 2 things happen. God acts, he intervenes, but also things are set in motion by God's nature in the universe. And so I'm asking myself always, is that just something that was set in motion by the nature of God? Or is that something that God intervenes specifically? I do believe he does both, But if I had to default to one or the other, I'm probably going to say that this is something that is happening because of the laws of nature, physics, chemistry, are a reflection, logic, mathematics. These are a reflection of God's character, and we're in a universe that is steeped in God. And so nothing is outside of his control, and often these things are set in motion, and then God intervenes. So my question is, well, which of those two is it? And because of the skeptic in me, I still resist that kind of language. Let's put it this way. If the Gospels had no supernatural events, if they were simply a story of a guy named Jesus who got some followers and preached a bunch of messages and then died, nobody would doubt the historicity or veracity of the Gospels. The tail that wags the dog on so much skepticism is our presuppositional bias against miracles. It's once Jesus starts doing miracles, we're out. But again, remember, you already believe that there's something supernatural, extranatural, outside of nature, space, time, and matter, that is the first cause of the universe. And that thing cannot be spatial, temporal, or material. This has been the struggle. A universe from nothing means just that. Space is not nothing. Space is something. Before the universe came into existence, there was no space, time, or matter, according to the science. So you already believe this thing that seems to be hanging you up. And so the question really is that first cause personal? That's all it is. Is it an impersonal force of some nature, or is it a personal being of some nature? And I think there's actually a good reason to believe it's a personal being. But that's really the only thing that separates me from the old Jim.
Yeah, so this idea of natural versus supernatural, even in your own story before coming to faith, can you explain a little bit about how natural and supernatural played out in your own story a little bit?
Yeah, I had to really struggle with this issue. And so I wrote a book called God's Crime Scene, which is I wrote after this book. But that was really something I had to do before becoming a Christian. I had to know, how do I explain the stuff in the universe as an atheist? And like I said before, I do think there are several things that need to be explained. For example, to give you one, I always wondered about how life originated. How do we get from inorganic matter to biological structures that are living and metabolizing and reproducing? That's still a mystery for almost all. The origin of life studies are about useless. And we're not getting any closer to that answer the more we study. As a matter of fact, the more we know about the basis of life, the more questions we have. So there's an atheist named Antony Flew, one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century. At the end of his life, there was one development in science that twisted him. And it twisted me early too. And that is that life is not based on physics or chemistry. Life is based on information. It's the information in the genome that forms proteins, the building blocks of life, from amino acids. You don't get proteins without the genome instructing the process. Now, look, I want to give you a gross analogy. If you can get information from physics and chemistry, then you don't need a God. But we have no experience and no example of information ever coming from physics and chemistry. We know that information comes from minds. So, for example, remember that body I showed you, the dead guy? He's laying on the floor. Next to him, there's blood spatter on the wall. Is it a murder? I don't know. I mean, he could have fallen. If he falls, hits his head, then physics and chemistry will determine what that blood spatter looks like. But if I got there, and instead of having blood spatter on the wall, I had written in his blood, he deserved it. Now I'm looking for a killer. Why? Because we know that information doesn't come from physics and chemistry. The information on the wall came from the mind of a killer. If there's information in the genome, we need to be looking for the mind that put it there. And when I realized that the best explanation for the information in the universe was a mind outside the universe, it did open up the door, at least, to be fair. Look, if that's true, if there's an all-powerful being that created everything from nothing, the most amazing miracle is not in the New Testament. It's not walking on water or rising from the grave. It's Genesis 1. Everything from nothing. If there's something out there that can do that, I'm thinking that dude can walk on water, because that's a small potatoes miracle compared to everything from nothing. So I just needed to be fair about my own bias against the supernatural.
We end up putting those barriers in place and it keeps us from experiencing the fullness that God has.
That's right.
Yeah. Jim, this has been fascinating. I just want to, as we kind of wrap this up, I just want to thank you for shedding light on a lot of these issues that have trumped up a lot of people that are now they would claim to be followers of Jesus, but there may be people watching right now and tuning in that you're still questioning. You still have a wrestle inside, and I think that what Jim has laid out is a great way to start investigating these claims. It's not enough just to put it to the side and disregard it. We should do the work. And so, Jim, I want to thank you for the work that you've done and for sharing your time with us this morning. I want to ask, would you close us out in prayer as we just wrap up the service?
Yeah, Father, I just pray that as people are hearing us today, that they would have their heart open, that you would start to move them toward a position of being anti. And sometimes we are that way. I've been that way for so many years, that you would at least open the door to the possibilities, so they can eventually take that road toward reasonable. And I just ask you, Father, to take the evidence that you've given us, that this is you're not asking us to believe something blindly. You've given us enough evidence to know it's true, even though we're not going to have every question answered. So, Father, would you start to answer the questions in the minds of those who have heard this today and move them toward making a decision, to realize that this faith, your voice, is not an unreasonable voice. That instead you've given us good reason to believe, and help us to take those reasons and turn them into faith and action. We pray this, Father, for all of those who are hearing, and we say this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ.